Before I begin, I want to get something out right up front because I have a feeling it will make some people close this video and not watch the rest of it, and I want to get that out initially rather than wait till later and try and trick anyone into thinking this is something that it isn't. As much as I can and do and will during this video heap praise upon Fallout 2, I did not enjoy replaying this game. It was one of those things where I was like, oh, God, I got to play through Fallout 2 again. And when I got up this morning to finish it off, I was like, oh, I've got to go finish Fallout 2. It was not what I would call an enjoyable experience. And it all boils down to the age of the game. I've said this before and I've said this again. Some games age better than others. There's no set marker for what ages well, and some people will disagree on what has aged well and what has not. My opinion, for me, this game has not aged well at all. And I found myself in a constant, non-stop struggle to try and get through the game. Now that I've said that, for me, it really all boils down to two things. The fact that the UI in general, which I'll discuss in a moment, and the graphics. And that's really weird coming from me, because usually I don't mind older graphics. They don't bother me as long as they're well done or well presented. But in this case, I actually my only complaint with the graphics was that in many cases I had legitimate trouble telling certain things. Like, for example, there was when I was crossing this one area, I had to talk to one of the tribesmen who was in the area. And I couldn't see them. I physically could not see the guy because he was in a brown suit and a brown pants on a brown background. And I was like, where the heck is he? I know he's around here somewhere. And I started just mousing over, trying to find him until I was like, oh, it's right in front of me. Hey, guy. I like to think that the Chosen One was literally like, where is this guy? As the guy's literally standing 3 feet in front of him. Where are you, man? Oh, there you are. Hi. And given how sarcastic the Chosen One is in general, that's not exactly infeasible. But the UI is the big issue, and I want to talk about that a bit because I've discussed UI problems in the past. In fact, I recently did a Crusader Kings 2 stream where I discussed that I felt that it was a fantastic game under a terrible UI. I stand by that statement. You can get used to the UI. You can get to the point where you know how to do what you want to do. But I still stand by my statement that doesn't make the UI good. It just means you have adapted to it. And before anybody thinks I am bashing that game, let me go ahead and say that there's a game of mine that I love that has the exact same problem. It's an old game called Star Wars Rebellion, or Star Wars Supremacy if you're in Europe, which has a terrible UI. But, once you get used to it, you can figure out what you're doing and how you're doing it. Defining a good UI is actually easier to do than most other things, in my opinion. And I wanted to discuss that briefly when we started here, because Fallout 2 might be one of the better examples I've seen of this. I also want to get one other thing out here right up front. This is a game that is actually better than its predecessor, at least in terms of pure mechanic and function. The UI of Fallout 1 is worse in every way than the UI of Fallout 2, and causes so many more issues. They actually added convenience features to Fallout 2, which I know someone who's never played Fallout 2 might find a little bit ridiculous, but it's true. I thought about making a list, and I decided it'd be kind of superfluous, but just trust me when I say that this is much better than Fallout 1 was in many ways. A UI is the means by which the player plays the game. The in-between. Think of it as the barrier and the translator between the player and what they're trying to do, or, in other words, the gameplay. And so, if in some games, there's really no real need for a UI in any strictest sense of the word. A typical Mario game can show you the level you're on and your coins and whatnot, just basic information on the screen, but that's not really the UI in the way that I'm using the term right now. That's more of a GUI, the graphical user interface. In other words, that's just information. That's a HUD. Is actually a better term for that. Let's use that. That's your HUD. That's not really the UI. The UI in the case of a Mario game is basically the controller. You hit this button to jump, you hold down this button to run, and then this button moves around, and that's pretty much it. For a game of increased complexity, obviously you need more than that. You need more buttons and more functionality. The fact that you can switch between modes with the right click and can interact with some things or look at some things based on which mouse mode you're in, and dragging and dropping items and stuff, that's the UI. And you can tell this is a game that was made back before basic convenience features kind of started becoming more and more of a thing, and before gaming design philosophy has moved forward, such that we have concepts nowadays like, say, just to name one example, a mini-map, or maybe the ability to put pins on a map, saying, okay, if you want to go even more old school, if you want to take some convenience out but add more agency to the player, want to have a map of the zone, just a little mini map. It's not labeled though. You have to actually go around and look at yourself, but you can add labels to it, and therefore say this is where this character is, this is where this shop is, this is where this resting area is, that kind of a thing. That's all absent. Now you of course could do that with pen and paper, but you can see why I mentioned that it's absent from the UI, because it is. And that's ignoring the other two basic concepts of a UI. First is what I call at a glance. The more information you have at a glance, the better. And Fallout 2 doesn't really pull that across that well. There's several situations where in order to figure out if you can do something or want to engage in something, you have to pull up a menu and pull up another thing and do this to do that. It's not that bad in that regard, but it was an issue more than a few times. The other issue is, of course, the fewer clicks, the better. In order to try and go to here, I need to go double-click here, then right-click, then left-click him, then click this, and then click this, and then I can actually interact with this guy and try and figure out what I'm going to do with him. Fewer clicks, the better, right? Very, very, very basic UI design stuff. The problem, though, is both of these are fairly easy to define things. If I was to actually sit down and just explain it, I would have to do it live. This would have to be something I'd do on stream to really explain why it just felt like a chore to play this game to me personally. So rather than continue talking about that, let's just go ahead and abandon that, because I think that's enough negativity for the day. And that's actually basically the only negativity I have to say about this game. And I mean that sincerely, because the funny thing is, I feel both the gameplay and the combat of this game are just fine. Recently, I've been trying very hard... By the way, sorry if I'm slouching, but my back is absolutely killing me today. Recently, I've been trying to make a distinction, to make it clear that I separate gameplay and combat into two separate categories. Because, while there's obviously some overlap between the two, a game can have good gameplay and bad combat, or good combat and bad gameplay. I can think of recent games that I'm not going to mention, because there's already some controversy running around them, that fall into that category. So, both the gameplay and the combat of this game were appealing to me. The combat was appealing to me mostly because, as much as it was rather simple, it was not overstated. One of the things I loved is as you're traveling on the overworld map, with very few exceptions, you would run into a random encounter and it would say, do you want to encounter them? It's up to you to decide if you actually want to go fight that random pack of bandits. And if you do, then you will probably get some experience and probably get some loot. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. And I love that agency of the combat is put on the player. Now, there are a few inescapable encounters, but there's not many of them. Most of them only happen in certain types of areas that you probably shouldn't be wandering around until you're at a certain point of the game anyways. Notably, the Enclave patrols closer to the coast, for example. The other thing about the combat, though, is with very, very, very few exceptions, you could basically go through this game without fighting. Again, player agency. It's all about you deciding how you want to do that. Now, I do have to take a step back and add a dose of reality here. If you don't know that, if you've never played Fallout 2 before, and you're just picking up an RPG, you're probably going to fix yourself fairly combat heavy, and the combat might get a little dragging, because as much as it is good, I think it is still somewhat absent. There's not a lot of options to do in combat other than, shoot or throw or punch or whatever and move. There's not a lot of terrain that matters. There's not a lot of special abilities or unique things you can do or cooldown abilities or, special interactions or combo effects or anything like that. There's not a lot of depth, in other words, to the combat. It is serviceable and fun, but only in a kind of a minor sort of a way. And again, the reason I give that a pass is because it is so easy and so functional, so built into the game to avoid combat in so many circumstances. Indeed, I actually don't know anyone personally who has not killed the President of the United States, that is to say Dick Richardson. I should say the President of the Enclave to make this clear, because I don't want anybody flagging this video for some stupid reason. So, President Richardson, we'll just make that clear. I know very few people in the last 10, 15 years who have not killed President Richardson with the super stem trick. Because it's just, I don't have to fight him. And then you don't have to fight the rest of the base. Because we know that now. We know how to play this game. We know that the game allows us to do that. That's something I'll mention in a minute here. So let's talk about the gameplay. I guess that was a short minute. The gameplay of the game in this case... As I was replaying this, I found myself reminded of how much this was like the older LucasArts adventure games. Do you remember those? I mean that in terms of tone, which I'll go into a little bit later, but also in terms of, imagine if you're playing an adventure game. Now, in most adventure games, even modern adventure games, your options are, okay, I need to get that ant over there to chew through this wire, which will cause this hanger to fall, and that'll make a noise, which will scare the bird, which will distract the guy, so he opens the window, and then I can reach in the window and steal his keys. You know, you have to do some ridiculous logic chain to get stuff to happen, right? But imagine if instead you have, like, say, about 5 options to deal with that guy, roughly. It's actually usually about 2 to 5, in my experience, options to deal with just about any situation you're running into. Usually, 2 is very low-balling it. I very rarely did I see less than 3 options for dealing with a situation, especially since just walking up and shooting someone is basically always an option. There's no essential NPCs in this game. You just, oh, hey, what's up? You can do that if you can get away with it. And that's pretty much the gameplay of this game. It is very RPG-y and adventure gamey, and I feel it kind of grabs the best of both worlds, because your stats are still relevant, your equipment is still relevant, but your choices are also relevant too. Nowhere is this more apparent than in New Reno, I would say, where you have an overwhelming number of different divergent paths, some of which coexist with others and some of which are mutually exclusive, in order to deal with the New Reno families and how exactly you're going to move through that situation. For reference, my preferred method is to go through, remove everyone except for, I wrote down the names, hang on, everyone except for the Wrights from power, and then smash the distilleries, so the Wrights have to actually do something to establish the city proper. Although that's only one method, and there are so many different methods of dealing with it. It's fantastic. I love it. And that's pretty much the core gameplay of the game. In fact, the only aspect of gameplay I personally dislike is the trial. Now, I've heard some people disagree with me on this, and that's great. You know, as usual, there's we can have different opinions and still talk about this. But for me, the trial, right at the very beginning, was too limiting. Because ultimately, you need to have one of 3 skills to really succeed at the trial. And that's assuming you know what you're doing. You need to be able to either sneak, or, pickpocket, punch, or talk your way through the situation. If you don't have those 3 options, then you're kind of screwed when you get to the end of it. And again, that's assuming you know what you're doing. And that's the perspective I want to give here. If you know what you're doing, the trial's just a joke. Just, okay, run, talk, just stun, onto the main game, right? I mean, just about everyone just rushes through there, right? Grabs the C4, it's not actually C4, you know, blows up the thing, completely avoids the rad scorpions and there's some rad scorpions there, and the ants, and just rushes through, you know. There's no need to fight any of that stuff, really. However, let's assume you don't know what you're doing. So before you're put in this trial, in which you are given only a melee weapon, which is a spear, or your fists, you're like, well, I really want to focus on energy weapons, and I really want to have big, heavy armor, and I want to be a speechy kind of a guy. And so then you walk in and then you're given a spear. It just feels like they made the trial without regard to the rest of the game. Because as much as there are, of course, 3 ways through the trial, those 3 ways are still especially limiting for so early in the game, because when I say 3 ways, I mean 3 ways, period. Not just combat in general, but very restricted combat. You have to melee him, you know, punch, right? Now, I know there's technically a 3.5 option there in which you can drop the spear and then grab it and hit him with it. I also know that if you do that and you're not quick enough, he will pick up the spear and kill you with it. But my point is, that's probably the only stain in what is otherwise a fantastic series of gameplay. Because from that point on, it's like, yeah, do whatever. If you can make this happen, the programmers probably thought it through and said, yeah, you can make that happen. One of the other things I want to mention about the game is that it is indicative of many older games, and whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is going to depend on you, of course. It doesn't hold your hand at all. One of the earliest quests I got, in fact, it was actually the 3rd quest I got in the game, had, when I got to, I can't think of the name of the town, it's the one right after Arroyo. And it's like, hey, go help me, you know, defend my Brahmin. Okay. And then 5 rad scorpions attacked me, and the end, right? The game in no way tries to tell you what level you should be at or what danger thing's at. Pretty much the only thing you get is the fact that the coast equals endgame. That's about it. I also mention this because I remember one of the first times I played this way back in the day, the first thing I did, by the way, I actually lived in California back then, was I was like, well, I'm going to go down the coast. Because I had family living in San Francisco. So, yeah, you could probably picture how that went. But I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It's just a commentary. Because it's indicative of a lot of older games, and that particular game design in general. And I stress this because whether or not Fallout 2 is a difficult game or not is going to universally depend on how much of a guide you have going into it, or how much of the game you already know going into it. It's what I've more and more started taking to call Final Fantasy V effect. FF5, for those of you not aware, is actually a pretty rough, very unforgiving game, unless you happen to know the game, in which case it is probably one of the most breakable of the FFs, because it has multiple different weapons of multiple different overpowered combinations that you can set up in order to just wreck the whole game. And there's usually like at least one, usually more than one strategy for every boss that they just are absolutely, they're just destroyed by. And I feel very strongly that way about Fallout 2, because it is very possible to rush through Fallout 2 and basically not fight anything. You don't even have to fight the final boss. It's like, alright, turn on the turrets, talk to the guys, stand back and watch. Yeah. I mean, yeah, he's got a bajillion health, but it doesn't matter. I mentioned I would talk about this, and I do want to talk about this. As much as the trial is too limiting, Fallout 2's ultimate benefit is about the freedom of action, and that's pretty much, I'd say, the core gameplay aspect of it. The freedom to choose your method of how to go through it. I still very much strongly believe that this is a linear story. You still always have to go and deal with, the Enclave. You still have to blow up the offshore base. You still have to follow the general path through Vault 13, etc. I mean, actually, that's not true. You don't have to go through Vault 13. But the point is, there's a fairly linear story still here. It's not like this is a choose-your-own-adventure, go in any direction. This is more of what I'm more and more calling the all roads lead to Rome style of game design. You have to get to that point on that platform, and you have to take out that Enclave base. But there's a lot of variance of what you could do between then and now in order to get to that point. The fact that speedrunners can beat this game in about 20 minutes probably highlights what I mean by that. But the next thing I want to talk about, I don't really have much else to say about gameplay, except for one last point. And this is what I want to talk about. This is kind of a sticking topic. I've brought this up in stream before, and several people of my stream viewers have disagreed adamantly, actually, on this point. Obviously, based on my preferences, I would love a proper remake of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. That would be amazing. I'd probably buy that day of for full price, without even hesitating. But I, of course, am using the term proper remake, which, by my own definition, means it is properly done. It is basically a new game with the content of the old, right? So what exactly defines a proper remake of Fallout 2? And this is where things got a little interesting, because a lot of people that I've asked about this, including viewers on chat and some people in person as well, have all disagreed on what exactly that defines. I've actually heard one person say there's no need to change anything. It works just fine as is. I mean, it's true. You can play Fallout 2 right now. I played the good old games version, consequently, and had no trouble getting it working without patching or messing with anything. I just hit play and boom, done. So, yeah, what exactly does define a proper remake of Fallout 2? And I, of course, leave this question for you to answer, because I'm sure I'll get different answers from you guys, just as I did from everyone else. But let's talk about the tone of Fallout 2. This is something I want to talk about more, because I forgot how much this was a comedy game. I want to diverge for just a moment and talk about something that was happening on my Fallout 3 roleplay, which I'm sure most of you don't even know I did. Now, for me, Fallout has always been a very, very, very dark setting. Very horrible, very bleak, no hope, no future kind of a situation. And I'm not sure where I got that impression, because when I went back through Fallout 2, I didn't get, any of that. I mean, there are some horrible people in here. Myron comes to mind immediately. But this is... I am reminded again of the old LucasArts adventure games, because even the more serious ones of those tended to have this lighter tone. I've talked about this concept before. There's a difference between a game that actively goes out of its way to be humorous and make jokes regularly, and a game that just has a lighter, more comedic tone to its approach. And that's what this one felt like. It felt like I was playing through a comedy game, a comedy adventure game, basically. And I was really, really thrown by that. A lot of that's on the Chosen One himself, because, you know, the Chosen One happens to be, well, you start off, and you're like, I'm just this naive idiot who has a bit of a sarcastic streak. And brilliant touch on behalf of the developers. The further into the game you get, at least if you're following a relatively intended progressive path, the more jaded your dialogue becomes, and the more cynical and the more sardonic, as opposed to merely sarcastic. It was actually kind of a nice touch. But that tone was prevalent almost throughout the whole thing. I mean, even the main villain is basically this relatively nice guy who happens to want to kill, you know, a whole lot of people. So rather than try to go ahead and discuss the story, which I really don't feel like I have a lot to talk about, to be completely blunt, I want to talk about a couple little things, then I'm going to start talking about some characters. I'm sorry I'm fidgeting so much. I'm in a lot of pain today. First, I want to talk about the Geck. This is something that was actually requested that I discuss completely separate from everything else. In Fallout 2, and arguably in Fallout 1 as well, the Geck was basically just an agriculture kit. Now I say just. It was a very nice, very well stocked, very well provisioned agriculture kit that would enable you to, if you had the knowledge of agriculture, be able to completely revitalize a given soil area and set up a lush farm kind of a situation. Very, very useful, very, very advanced, very, very valuable, something that would be immeasurably valuable in the post-apocalypse situation, or actually post-post, because this is a post-post-apocalypse game, as opposed to Fallout 1, which is a post-apocalypse game, but moving on. I mention that because in Fallout 3, and, well, that's it. In Fallout 3, the Geck is basically a magical device that has the ability to purify radiation and completely revitalize and alter stuff. It's basically closer to the Genesis device from Star Trek 2, as opposed to an agriculture kit. Now, the funny thing is, I was asked to comment on how much Bethesda ruined the entirety of the Fallout mythos and lore. And let's be clear. Bethesda clearly did not care about established lore and just wanted to make their own. I actually commented on that in my Fallout 4 rumination, and I think I've commented on that going through Fallout 3 as well. However, that doesn't bother me as much as it does seem to bother other people. Mainly because as long as they do something good with it, then I'm okay with it. It's the whole purist argument again. See my X-Men Apocalypse video for a good example of what I mean about the purist argument, or my Lord of the Rings stuff, for that matter. Now, if that bothers you, that's fine. I do understand why that bothers you. I'm just saying it doesn't quite bother me. But I bring that up again because, for me, Fallout 2, if I was to describe the tone of the Fallout games, I would describe Fallout 1 as, oh my gosh, it's a wasteland. I would describe Fallout 2 as la la da da la da da la da da. I would describe Fallout 3 as a constant atmospheric, fear-riddled adventure. I would describe Fallout New Vegas as amazing, and Fallout 4 as far more the... Man, I don't know what the hell... Let's just ignore Fallout 4 for the moment. And that's the tonality of each game for me. So for me, Fallout 3 resonated more just because that atmosphere and that tone was far more impacting to me than the let's go have an adventure kind of a thing that we've got going on in both of the first Fallout games. However, again, I've already pissed off my audience. I don't want to piss them off anymore. All I will say is that I am looking forward to the new Wasteland game and moving on. I'm sorry. God, my back. Ugh. I'm going to kind of rush through the rest of this. Let's talk about Sulik. I'm just going to start looking at my notes here. So, Sulik is one of your... he's a good character to start with. Fellow tribal, one of the first people you meet. Him and Vic are basically your first companion characters you're going to get. And it's a shame that the sister quest kind of didn't really go anywhere, and there was going to be like the other thing with, what's his face? He Who Walks, or He Who Is in Shadow, or whatever his name is. But he's good early on. He's actually a very good character early on because he's good at melee, and he doesn't really rely on supplies or equipment to really be that useful, which is good because by the time you get him, you don't really have supplies or equipment, so he's far more useful of a character to have around. I also like him because he is a fellow tribal, and it helps to establish the culture of tribals in general. Keep in mind, each tribe has their own thing, but the general concept of who the tribals are versus the more sophisticated city folk we'll meet later versus the Enclave we'll meet even later. There's like 3 tiers of culture to Fallout 2, and those are them. You've got the cult tribals, you've got the city, and then you've got the organizations, which actually I would lump the NCR and the Enclave in the organizations part. Possibly the Brotherhood, but not really. And the early part of the game, there's so much about how the tribals function, how the tribals are pretty much exactly what they sound like. You know, they are towns, they are huts. You know, you go to this place that has a few buildings, and that's a big city compared to what you're used to as a simple little tribal. And there's a huge amount of bias and prejudice from almost everyone 1 tier up to everyone 1 tier below them. The city folk almost universally look down upon the tribals, and of course the ghouls, for that matter, who are usually viewed as tribals. And then the major organizations usually look down at the city folk as if they're beneath them, or just, you know, pieces to be moved around on the board. So, you know, nice staggered classism thing going on there. Vic, of course, is also another thing that's great for early on. He's very loyal. He's very simple, and again, he's a fairly good intro companion for us from more of a story perspective because there's not a lot of complexity to him, and yet that's kind of what we need early game. We don't need to be dumped immediately with all of the complexity of what's going on. We just need our first few tastes of it. Remember, our character is getting their first few tastes of the wastes just as well as the player is. Although, admittedly, if you played Fallout 1 before, that's not true. But you get my idea. You get my point. That leads me to Marcus. Now, Marcus is interesting because, first of all, he's voiced by Michael Dorn, which is awesome. But second of all, he is probably one of the only truly good guys that we see in all of Fallout 2. First of all, I liked his connection to Fallout 1. It was a nice way to call back to the Master and the plight of the super mutants and all that fun stuff. Second of all, I have to admit I really grinned at seeing him in New Vegas. I know we're not talking about New Vegas right now, but the fact that he was there in New Vegas was awesome. But he serves as an excellent contrast because Marcus is kind of crude and kind of ill-spoken, and yet very much a decent person who, through actions, demonstrates himself to be a good person. I mention that because that's going to serve as an important contrast for many characters later, notably President Richardson himself, but also a few others like, I can't remember her name, Lynette, and pretty much all of the leaders of Reno, as a way to showcase, here's someone who actually has a sense of morals and ethics, and is basically a crude individual as a consequence thereof. Myron. What the hell can I say about Myron? Myron is interesting, though, because he is brilliantly written to be... there's 2 layers to him. The surface layer is that he's this despicable, worthless, repugnant, horrible person. You can actually sell him into slavery and get no negative consequence for it. No karma loss. Think about that. It's the only one you can do that to. At least I think he's the only one you can do that to. I'm not sure, but I know you can do it with him. He's also one of the few people that people are willing to get the child killer perk for killing him. He is lewd, he is abrasive, he is designed to be unpleasant in every way possible. Oh, by the way, he also started a drug market pretty much by himself, and if you kill him, well, okay, even if you don't kill him, the plot goes out of its way to kill him and ensures that his name does not go on. Nobody even remembers who the hell Myron is. Thing is, that's the first layer. He's basically a character. Fiction in general does this. They make someone who is as irritating and frustrating as possible so that the player or the viewer can then cheer when they get their comeuppance. The reason I say he has a second layer is because he won. Myron has in many ways caused so much of a long-term deleterious impact on the entire wasteland because of his introduction of Jet into it. Think about how many people's lives have been ruined or hurt or damaged because of the usage of Jet, and how much of the drug trade that is pushed, how much of the prostitution or slavery trades that is pushed, all because this one teenage kid pushed the Jet out into the system. So, as much as it's like, yeah, he got his comeuppance, in the end, he ultimately actually had way more of an impact than we do as the player character. Yeah. By the way, just to bring this up, Fallout 4, I want to say, posited the idea that Jet existed in the pre-war society. And I have heard more than one person look at that and say, well, that's a retcon. Now, to be clear, that's a retcon. Bethesda doesn't actually care about pre-existing canon. We've already talked about this. I only bring this up for the sake of completion, because that actually isn't really contradictory, even if it was intended as contradictory. Because it's not that out of character from Myron to have discovered Jet from some pre-war thing and decided to invent it and tag his name onto it. I could actually see him doing that. And I could see him trying to inflate his own already overblown ego as a result of his invention that he didn't invent. And that's the only reason I'm willing to give that a pass, because personally that makes Myron even more despicable and more pathetic. And as a result, I kind of like that. But I just thought I'd share that because of that reason. Goris is interesting. First of all, Goris was a great twist back in the day. When I first met Goris, it was like, oh, yeah, okay. Oh, huh? Yeah, okay. That caught me a little bit by surprise, especially since I didn't think Deathclaws could, do that. But, it's... The whole Deathclaw Vault 13 situation was a nice touch because, we were all... Anybody who's played Fallout 1 was pretty much trained to fear Deathclaws in general. And, of course, they sweep in and take out the Deathclaws, Frank Horrigan and crew sweep in and take out the Deathclaws right after we have been introduced to them and made to feel for them. So it's like, it's this double emotional punch. First it's like, oh god, it's Deathclaws. Oh, okay, they're friends. Oh god, the Deathclaws are being killed. Just bam, bam, right there, just like that throughout the whole Vault 13 situation. It's a very nice double punch there. I liked Goris in particular. The only thing I didn't like about Goris is, as a result of Goris's natural side effects of being a Deathclaw, you can't really do much with him. I mean, you can, have him in early game, but about mid-game starts to be a little bit less useful. In end-game, can't do anything against Enclave troops. This is a good time as any to talk about Frank Horrigan, actually. So, I actually, as I was going through this, Frank Horrigan showed up for 4 cutscenes for me, counting the time when you actually fight him. Barely any presence on screen at all. Although that's appropriate because the villain of the whole game only shows up for 1 cutscene. So, I mean, it's that kind of a game, right? But Frank Horrigan, for reasons that I still don't fully understand, has always been, in my mind, as probably one of the most dangerous individuals in the Fallout universe. Right up there alongside the PCs, because he is effectively a player character who happens to be an enemy. He is an unstable soldier who became a variant of a super mutant who had power armor grafted onto his body. Yeah, he is a frickin' dangerous monstrosity. And, of course, he's voiced by Michael Dorn. But I think when I was going through this, I had to decide why I didn't dislike his usage as a character. I usually tend to dislike that type of approach to a character. Like, for example, the Elder Vampire in Witcher 3, which that's all I'm going to say to avoid spoilers, but the Elder Vampire in Witcher 3, for me was just like, ugh, it couldn't buy it. It was just, come on, really? In this case, first of all, they go way out of their way to establish his credentials, why he's so dangerous. But second of all, and this is more important for me, they go out of their way to explain why it's difficult for them to use him. He is basically a walking, death machine. But aiming and directing him is very difficult, and controlling him is even more difficult, despite his clear loyalty to the United States. He is, and this is mentioned many times by other people and other Enclave soldiers as well, he is very unstable, and if you put him into a direction, he's probably just going to destroy whatever happens to be over there. He is, in effect, a one-use type, or not one-use, he is only useful for one type of activity, and that is destroying whatever happens to be in front of him. So that brings him down significantly to the point where he doesn't actually come across as a Mary Sue. Instead, he comes across as a frickin' wrecking ball. Also, if I may be so bold, I find it hilarious the fact that if you try to fight him normally, he's an absolutely insanely hard boss, and me and my friends used to consider him the super optional of Fallout 2. Now, I know that sounds weird because you have to fight him, but as I think I mentioned earlier, you can reprogram the turrets, and you can talk the people into fighting him, and then literally just sit back and watch them deal with him. So, you don't actually really have to fight him, and I've known that since forever. It goes back to that whole freedom, choice, knowing what you're doing thing. Let's talk about Lenny while we're at it. I like Lenny a lot. He's actually probably my favorite of the companions, and he was the one I used for the majority of this playthrough. I feel like he's a bit of a missed opportunity story-wise, because he is someone who is normal, ordinary person who missed the call to adventure and feels regret about it, but then has a second chance to rise up and become an adventurer and seizes on it and rises up from normalcy to become basically one of the best characters. I mean, he's got a ridiculously huge health pool. He can heal, and he can wear power armor. He is, in my personal opinion, the best endgame companion from a purely gameplay and combat perspective. But I say he's a bit of a missed potential because he could have been more insight into our character, because he is what we are. We are normal, ordinary people, aside from the fact that we happen to be of the bloodline of the Vault Dweller. We just are the guy, as all Fallout main characters are, because of the fact that we rose up to the challenge and just kind of endured and kept going throughout it. Ignoring the fact that there's that one line where you can actually say, no, I'm the main character of this game, as a bit of dialogue in-game. But anyways, I digress. I only have a few more notes here, guys. So most of what I've been talking about to date has mostly been about the tribal stage of things. When we get to the city state and the government state of things, we start talking about Vault City, for example, and New Reno. Those are probably the two really biggest ones for me personally. First of all, let's talk about Lynette, because, God, I hate Lynette. Lynette might actually be my second most hated character in this game, and the only reason she's second is because of frickin' Myron, who was designed to be horrible. Lynette is a wonderful bit of foreshadowing, because she is effectively President Richardson, except for the fact that she doesn't have the power or the intelligence or the attitude that he does. She is basically a President Richardson light kind of a character. It's a nice way to ease us into that type of concept, showcase what that kind of person is capable of, even in a relatively small position with relatively little power and relatively little influence. She is still able to make life pretty miserable for a lot of people around her. And I love the fact that you can approach her and say, well, we could just, you have the technology and the parts to help the radiation problem with the power plant. And she's like, no, I want you to go kill them, you moron. And she acts like it's your problem for not picking up on that. I also, personally, I believe there's some information to back this in some of the Fallout Bible stuff, but I always think that McClure actually took over, and she just kind of went away. She's also relevant because she's so she has a few ties to the NCR, and there's like a whole complicated thing I don't want to get into about how the NCR is trying to reach out in this direction through more peaceful means, but isn't, and there's just all this stuff going on. And that leads me to John Bishop, more than anything else, because John Bishop is an excellent example of what an organization like the NCR needs, because John Bishop is a terrible, disgusting, horrible, deplorable, evil human being. And yet he is actively trying to better the wasteland through his actions. Now, he's doing it for his own sake. He does it because he will get more power. He's doing it because he will advance his own position. But someone with the kind of connections and the kind of influence he has is invaluable to an organization like the NCR, which is why they're willing to work through and with him. Which, of course, before I go forward and talk about the other families in New Reno, I want to talk about Roger Weston. Because Roger Weston is a perfect contrast to the previous two characters I just mentioned, Lynette and Bishop. Weston is someone who is a fairly decent individual, relatively speaking. He's not good, but he is certainly not evil. And he wants to see the NCR expand, and he wants to see the NCR expand peacefully to actually bring civilization and the benefits of society to other cities and to other peoples. But he isn't above playing hardball. He is capable of actually doing the dirty, underhanded politicking that is required in order to make that happen in a modern society. And I like that because it shows the stark contrast between Bishop and Weston. Bishop is out for himself and is doing underhanded, dirty politicking. Weston is out for the good of the society and is doing underhanded, dirty politicking. And I like that because this is very typical of the writing style of the time. Black Isle, I believe, is the label who specifically put this up. But you get the idea, the old team. The idea that this is a complicated situation. Just because you do evil acts does not make you evil. There's shades there, layers, and I love that. I love that contrast. A little old, but still good. This brings me to the Mordinos, who are far more classically evil because they're far more inclined towards drugs. They're basically your typical drug family. Not family, excuse me, drug cartel. And the leader of the Mordinos is actually probably the easiest one to kill. Here, have some jet. Oh. And that brings me to the Salvatores. Now, I would call the Salvatores the most dangerous of the four families. I actually think I mentioned this earlier. Oh, no, I mentioned the Wrights earlier, right? Because they are a miniature version of the Enclave. If you look at New Reno, all of the overall geopolitical situation of all of Fallout 2 is mirrored in miniature, in a microcosm within New Reno. The Salvatores are the Enclave in this situation. They do not have the manpower, they don't have the resources, they have the technology. And they know how to use that technology quite well. And this is, of course, even more further hammered in by the fact that the Salvatores are actually working with the Enclave. But this also means, so we have the tech superiority of the Salvatores, the drug runners of the Mordinos, the politicking of the Bishops, and this all leads, of course, to the Wrights. Now, the Wrights are the most classic mafia of all of the families in Reno. They're basically just in the alcohol trade, and they're actually a family, too. And there's so much you can do with all these people. It's actually, this is another game that might better suit, well, I couldn't even do a lore run of this situation because there's just so many different things. I'd have to be like, okay, I'm going to go through New Reno like 8 times to showcase all the things you can do, you know? However, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Wrights you can leave in charge of New Reno and smash their stills, in which case the Mafia decides, well, you know, we might as well make the town a nice place anyways, and they do so. Let's go ahead and talk about the NCR and the... I don't need my notes for this part. I know what I'm talking about now. Let's talk about the Enclave and the NCR. Now, the NCR is pretty much firmly and formally turned into a major power through this game and during your actions and reactions and the quest line you can do as far as the NCR line. As I mentioned many times going through New Vegas, the NCR are not the good organization any more than the Enclave are the evil organization. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous since the NCR are trying to, you know, expand and spread the benefits of society, and the Enclave are trying to wipe out millions, but that is truly how they are both presented. The NCR, and this is what I've always loved about the NCR, are presented as a society. And they have never whitewashed that. They never tried to make them out as the good guys. There might be good people working with the NCR, and there are definite benefits to being alongside the NCR. But the NCR's entire purpose is that they are a society. The Enclave, I've got a point I'm building up to here. The Enclave are far more... the Enclave are more about control. Rather than trying to spread their technology and their resources to the rest of the wastelands, they're trying to wipe out the wasteland and then settle it. I know this is going to sound like a weird parallel, but I'm reminded of Master of Orion 2. When you are conquering an enemy territory, an enemy planet in Master of Orion 2, fundamentally you have 2 options. You can conquer them through invasion and slowly acclimate those people to your society, or you can wipe them all out and send your settlers in to take it. And you see why I'm making this parallel? Because these are the 2 sides of the coin of the NCR and the Enclave. The Enclave is basically just, we need to wipe out everything that isn't us, and then we'll go settle it, and we'll spread and probably push a eugenics program, and Dr. Schreiber would do horrible, evil things, because that's all he's there for. You know. And they have this ridiculous concept of eugenic purity. And I do say ridiculous. It has been fundamentally proven many times in many different works, including this one. This was also brought up in Fallout 3, that the whole eugenics purity thing of humanity is actually a complete load of bollocks when it comes to who is defined as a mutant and who is defined as, human and whatnot. But they're wanting to basically, what it boils down to, despite all their preaching about that, is their people. They want their people to settle the new world, and under their laws, their restrictions, their mentality, their technology, their bloodlines will be the ones to move forward and expand into the wasteland. The NCR is far more about people, just any people, really. As long as you're willing to work with us, we're willing to work with you. Just trying to build connections between people. It's far more, ironically, there's also kind of a little bit of a variance of personal power, the Enclave has more of, and political power, which the NCR has more of. The other thing I wanted to mention here really quick while we're talking about the NCR and their approach to things and the society approach to things, the underbelly, the bad that comes along with societal progress, the bad that comes along with if you just start including a whole massive group of people. Because you're not going to have a group of good people. That usually doesn't work that way. You're going to have a group of people. Good, bad, in between, doesn't care. Variety. I like that variety. The point that I'm trying to build to, though, is that throughout Fallout 2, you have the overall choice of approaching the wasteland with your perspective of how should it proceed. Because there's an undercurrent theme throughout all of Fallout 2. And it basically boils down to agrarian versus civilized. I mentioned earlier the class divides, but ultimately, even though I mentioned the 3 class tiers, there's actually really only 2 groups there. Civilized and agrarian. Now, the interesting thing is, we see both sides of both sides. We see agrarian societies that are peaceful, coexist, have happy, enjoyable lives without, sickness or death or disease, and who are just able to make things work, as long as they have the resources to do so, of course. We also see agrarian societies that are horrific, murdering, cannibalistic, traitorous, slavering scum. Right? We see both sides of that. And we see both sides of the civilized perspective. We see civilized people who are interested in trying to help and coordinate and work together and build bonds and to help move society forward. And we see civilized people who are more interested in their own power or their own bigotry, or don't care about others, or actively want to hurt others, or want to impose their will on others, etc. We see many different layers of good and bad when it comes to both perspectives. And then we're basically left with the choice of, which. Now, I say we're left with because the game never actually lets you make that choice. I mean, yeah, you can help establish the NCR and spread their power, and yeah, you can help some of the tribal areas and help them out. But my point is, it never really boils down to like one binary choice at the end of the quest. And as weird as this sounds, I like that. Because what instead happens is the player, in this case me, is left with the impression, left with the theme just kind of bouncing around in my head thinking, well, which is better? I mean, is there anything inherently wrong with an agrarian-sized society so long as they have access to the knowledge and technology they need to really function, to have defenses against sickness and have the ability to have agriculture, for example, like a little Geck kicked, for example. But of course, that kind of thing probably wouldn't exist without society, without civilization. To get to the level of technological advancement required to do that requires those kind of underpinnings, right? Which, of course, is kind of the point. The agrarian groups, the tribals of this world, are in a unique position to have access to technology that they wouldn't normally have in order to function in a society that isn't actually a society. To basically be able to live in a way that normally wouldn't be possible if they had just, if the pre-war civilization had never existed, the agrarian society would never last. Just like it didn't last in real life. So what do you think, guys? I do hope I've done a decent job. I'm sorry if I'm a little distracted. I am in a lot of pain right now. But I hope you've enjoyed. Next week we're looking at another older game, which I know also has not aged particularly well, so hopefully we'll have a little bit of our time of it. But regardless, I'll see you around, guys.